this presentation and introduce our next speaker. Debashree Dattaray is Associate Professor in Comparative Literature in Jadavpur University. She has received the Fulbright Alumni Award 2019, Fulbright Nehru Visiting Lecturer Fellowship at UC Berkeley in 2013, Erasmus Mundus Europe Asia Fellowship at the University of Amsterdam in 2012, and Fulbright Doctoral Fellowship at SUNY Stony Brook in 2007. She is author of Oral Traditions of the Northeast, a case study of Karbi oral traditions, and has co-edited At the Crossroads of Literature and Culture, Following Forkhead Paths, Discussions on the Narrative, Eco-Criticism and Environment, Rethinking Literature and Culture, and has been issue editor for a special volume on Indigenous Studies for LitCrit, an Indian response to literature from December 2017. She has been principal investigator for the Jadavpur University RUSA 2.0 project on locating indigeneity in the Global South, revival, conservation, and sustainability. Welcome, Debashree. I pass the floor on to you.
Thank you so much. While I speak, if you could just show the first 7 slides, that would be very helpful. And I would let you know after that while I speak. So I'll be speaking about a little area in Northeast India known as Karbi Anglong, which is in Assam. And I'm trying to look into the interdisciplinary work done to textualize and preserve oral traditions by the Center for Karbi Studies and Karbi Lamet Amai in Karbi Anglong. The Karbis, of course, are one of the largest hill communities in Assam in India and have struggled over the years for retention of their cultural identity and sovereignty. The Karbi Lamet Amai and the Center for Karbi Studies have actually worked extensively for the preservation of Karbi oral heritage. And these institutions have actually contributed to the documentation and preservation of oral traditions, which in turn are embedded in the cumulative experiences and teachings of indigenous communities. If you could please show the next few slides. Thank you so much. Rupika Risam writes of the need for the creation of new methods, tools, projects, and platforms to undo the epistemic violence of colonialism and fully realize a decolonized digital humanities. Given the history of discrimination and negation of indigenous communities in the northeast of India, the process of archiving and documentation has been a slow and tenuous process. What I want to look at are recent ways of giving you examples of indigenous agency that have been established in the digital space within the Karbi community. The next few slides, please. It is now possible, albeit in extremely adverse circumstances, to think of the promise of the digital humanities as an opportunity to intervene in the digital cultural record, to tell new stories, shed light on counter histories, and create spaces, as Risam tells us, for communities to produce and share their own knowledge should they wish. The next 3 slides, please. Thank you. We, of course, know that indigenous scholars have often resisted the digital humanities since the question of appropriation of stories data have been abiding concerns for indigenous communities. According to Mohawk artist Kavenati and Cherokee scholar Jason Lewis, if Aboriginal people learned one thing from contact, it is the danger of seeing any place as terra nullius, even cyberplace. Its foundations were designed with a specific logic built on a specific form of technology and first used for specific purposes like allowing military units to remain in contact after a nuclear attack. The ghosts of these designers, builders, and prime users continue to haunt the blank spaces. So the basic premise of memory has articulated resistance to inaccurate and fabricated central narratives of control that we would like to call history. Memory, as we know, acts as a safeguard against attempts to silence voices of aggression or dissidence. And in turn, memory is often silenced or implicated in that act of silencing. It is in this context of such temporalities that one would like to discuss the preservation of oral traditions in Karbi Anglong. The next slide, please. Um, since its inception in 1966, the Karbi Lamet Amai has been an apex literary body of Karbi Anglong and has been instrumental in the preservation of Karbi language. In a project funded by the National Science Foundation involving the Karbi Lamet Amai and Linda Konert, the following were archived online that would promulgate the language of the Hills Karbi. The online collection comprised a total of 2 hours, approximately 12,500 words, of 9 folk stories, 2 personal narratives, 1 another narrative, 1 stimuli-based narrative, 4 procedural text, and 1 conversation and interview. It's this important collaboration of Karbi Lamet Amai, which was established for the promotion of the Karbi language in schools and institutions across Karbi Anglong. With its headquarters at Difu, the KLA has had branches across Karbi Anglong in villages and towns as well. And it has been integral to the history of Karbi letters. Indeed, it is important to locate critical knowledge in Indigenous contexts that challenge diverse forms of marginalization. The world as we seem to know it today is now witnessing the emergence of a digital resistance to all forms of colonial and imperial violence that enable the development of creative methods of acknowledging Indigenous ways of life across online networks. In a very creatively titled essay, Drumbeats to Drum Bites, Aswi Muskegon Istri writes that the digital world has transformed into a veritable platform for Indigenous presence in the midst of the colonial apocalypse. And goes on to say that to govern ourselves means to govern our stories and our ways of telling stories. It means that the rhythm of the drumbeat, the language of smoke signals, and our Mokazan telegraph can be transformed to the airwaves and modems of our times. We can determine our use of the new technologies to support, strengthen, and enrich our cultural communities. In fact, the protest against Dakota Access Pipeline that many of you would be aware of, construction on the sacred Lakota Sioux lands, found more than 1 million supporters who used Facebook to check into Standing Rock in solidarity with water protectors. In Australia, the vast survivors of stolen generations organized networks of social support as they tried to relocate families across ancestral lands. In fact, as recent as May 21, we know that 315 unmarked graves of children were found at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, Canada. And the news led global initiatives of solidarity among Indigenous communities across the digital platform and actually redefined the meaning of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. The next slide, please. Digital affirmation and resistance through Facebook check-in, Twitter hashtags, Instagram stories, YouTube channels, blogs, signs, listservs have functioned as some of the most crucially publicly accessible placemaking platforms that recenter and recirculate Indigenous issues into the public consciousness. So the Center for Karbi Studies promulgates Karbi history and traditions through its page, including information of academic and cultural achievements within the Karbi community. So Dharam Singh Teron, who is the founder of the center and one of the administrators of the page, tells us that digital presence for Karbi culture is definitely very important because of its easy and affordable accessibility. However, Tehran cautions us that on the fact that the presence is not vibrant, to the contrary, it's becoming more anarchic due to the so-called freedom of expression that digital platforms offer, which is at times doing more harm than good. Tehran's concerns should be read in the larger context of archiving of Karbi material culture and narratives and the difficult truth of appropriation. The Center for Karbi Studies was established in 2015 as an independent research organization of Karbi scholars, activists, and academics. The logo for the center is inspired by the traditional red, black, white color and represents the Mi-ring rang, a Karbi equivalent of the universal symbol of a labyrinth that stands at the doorway of life and death and rebirth. The logo, as we would notice, also has the numerical 9 embedded in each of the 3 squares, as the numerical holds special significance in Karbi worldview. Through the Facebook page, the logo has become synonymous to the assertion of Karbi identity and belief system. The digital platform has also provided networks for the presenting instances of Karbi cuisine, language, and textiles. For instance, a funding from the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research enabled a collaboration between the Center for Karbi Studies and the Kohima Institute in Nagaland to facilitate translation and musical annotation of the Kechare Alum funeral epic in Karbi Anglong. And this happened in 2017, and the Kechare Alun being the Karbi word for song, is one of the most significant and longest single piece of chanted poetry in the Karbi oral tradition repertoire. And the project enabled its recording and transcription and archiving for the first time. In an essay called The Archive After Theory, Ward and Wisnicki write, "We cannot have a future archive without the realization of the digital archives haunting by the imperial archive, an acceptance of the impossibility of ever being free of that ghost, and a bedrock reliance on critically mediated digital building to accommodate the dual position. It is this very sense of afterness that affords the digital archive a future orientation that is not utopian and a past orientation that never stagnates." The next slide, please. If you could look at the next 2 slides, one after the other, this would help me. Yeah, so these were some of the books that came out by the Center for Karbi Studies, very instrumental, one of the first books that came out, which actually had Karbi literature being published in, and Karbi writers being given a space to express themselves. The next slide, please. Yeah. So a Fulbright alumni project in 2019, which I led in collaboration with the Center for Karbi Studies, brought together 3 generations of Karbi women, weavers, professionals, and students together for an intensive workshop that would archive songs related to weaving in the region. Indigenous storytellers, weavers, such as Kasang Terongpi Kajek Tokpiki Bina Rongpipi, that's Kasang, who is one of the oldest Karbi storytellers that you see in the collage in front of you, were involved in this archiving of songs related to weaving. The project also initiated, perhaps for the first time, conversation between Karbi women weavers, urban Karbi women, and experts in Indigenous studies and gender studies to develop a collective of women groups working for the community within and also beyond the platform of the Center for Karbi Studies and its far-reaching digital presence in social media. The Center for Karbi Studies has also actually tried to archive material by a master storyteller, Longsing Bay, one of the most iconic Karbi storytellers in contemporary times. And if you look into the next slide, please. In 2020, the Center for Karbi Studies also organized a month-long tenuous process of digitization of Karbi language, language teaching, literature and culture, and the representation of Karbis through an orientation program organized by young Karbi scholars. One of the organizers of the event, Sabine Rongpipi, explains further on the digital presence, and she says, it is important to first understand what kind of digital representation is being carried out, by whom and for whom. Minority communities that rely heavily on orality walk on cultural fragility when it comes to digital representation. Orality carries variations, versions, and it is on these variants that the cultural richness of the communities depend. Digitization is in a way similar to the written word. Once something is digitized and accessed by the public, it becomes the representative of, let's say, a folklore tradition that effectively erases the multidimensionality of it. When then will be represented or forced to become a representative is one-dimensional that cannot reflect the actual depth of a culture. Sabine's also concern is with the idea of representation itself, its relationship to a sense of place, the idea of representation, and what is probably for the young Karbi community, their desire is to explore possibilities that would promote, renew, and enrich indigenous worldviews, and that would perhaps enable the creation of a platform for virtual sovereignty. As members of indigenous communities, these youngsters have participated in what Cherokee sociologist Eva Marie Garuth terms indigenism, the communal influence one another towards one another and towards substantial decolonization efforts, right? So the disruption and dismantling of exploitative non-indigenous epistemic structures that threaten community lifeways is a crucial goal. As we move into virtual domains, we too are sneaking up and setting up camp, making this virtual and technologically mediated domain our own. Rondel writes, however, we stake a claim here too as being an intrinsic part of this place, the very roots, or more appropriately, roots. So let's use our collective indigenous unconscious to remember our contributions and the physical beginnings that were pivotal in how the virtual reality was constructed. Indigenism, if you move on to the next slide, please. Indigenism promulgates the meeting of ideological positions within a framework of responsible and ethical modes of assertion. The digital platform provides an evolving site of knowledge system that impact both large-scale global social transformations as well as microcosmic initiatives of change and movement in response to deeply entrenched histories of social injustice and exploitation. Arundhati Roy writes, the only thing worth globalizing is dissent. Therefore, it's imperative to work towards the possibility of a digital platform that would recognize indigenous practices, vocabularies, and rhetorical concepts in relation to indigenous presentation and ethics. Thank you very much, or as they say in Karbi, Kurbantu. Thank you so much.